An over 2,000-year-old tradition, sake brewing is key to understanding Japanese culture and food. Today, I will be using my own culinary skills to better understand sake and why in the last century there's been a steady decline of sake consumption and production across the world. On the menu today, we have seared scallops with a sake reduction sauce and a fennel and grapefruit salad. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just prepping the salad before I start working on the sauce, and then I will sear the scallops and plate everything. A common misconception about sake is that it's rice wine, but the process for producing sake is actually a brewing process. So here you can see me segmenting grapefruit, which is going to go in my salad with the fennel. And the reason why I chose these ingredients is because they really enhance and reflect the flavors that are present in the sake, which I'm going to be using for this dish. And that is a junmai sake. Junmai means pure rice. You only need 4 ingredients to create junmai, which is pure sake. Now, those 4 ingredients are rice, water, yeast, and koji. Koji contains an enzyme that breaks down the rice, allowing for the alcoholic fermentation to begin. A key part of any sake production is rice polishing. Now, rice polishing has a very complicated history in Japan, but for the purposes of today, I'm just going to be talking about the rice polish of the sake I am using in this recipe. About 70% of the rice grain still remains in this junmai sake, which means a lot of the starches that were originally present in the rice still remain, creating a very umami and rich, full-bodied flavor in the sake, similar to a Chardonnay. Now, you may be wondering, as I was when I first started this research, about why sakes were predominantly clear and not aged and yellow, as a lot of grape wines are. And this is because in 1878, there was basically a ban on wood barreling of sake. Before we jump back into the history of sake, I just want to briefly mention that I've moved on from the salad to making the sake reduction sauce. In the 19th century, sake was a huge income for the Japanese government and for the Japanese producers. Barreling created an evaporation and a loss of sake quantity because as the sake aged, some of it would evaporate into the air or get absorbed by the wood in the barrels. So, the government encouraged sake producers to begin using ceramic tanks to ferment their sake. Sake production and export was so important to the economic welfare of Japan that actually there was a ban of doburoku, which is a home brewing sake tradition. At the turn of the 20th century, more and more professional brewers were entering the sake market. And so the government raised the tax of sake production to 35%. This enormously helped the efforts during the Russo-Japanese War. As you can see, I've begun plating my dish. So first I'm laying down the salad, and then I've gone on to plate the scallops, and that will be followed by the sauce. Now, these flavors are really meant to highlight the sake. As you might have noticed during the searing of the scallops, I began basting the scallops with my spoon, and that was actually sake that I was basting onto the scallops. And those scallops are also going to be covered by the sake reduction sauce. There's a lot of really delicate umami flavors happening here, and so I'm garnishing with dill and fennel fronds, which I think the freshness of them will juxtapose really nicely with the umami of the sake sauce and the scallops. And there we have it, Messiagare. Moving on to dessert, I'm very excited to share this recipe because I think that the nigori, which is a cloudy sake, paired really well with the creamy custard of the creme brulee. So I'm just starting by making a basic custard, which consists of egg yolks, cream, sugar, and salt. Now, unlike junmai, this sake has a mild, sweet, and cream-like finish, whereas junmai is a drier, more full-bodied sake. Because nigori sake has a milder and sweeter flavor, I really didn't want too much to be getting in the way on the palate of the sake flavor. So I'm keeping it very simple, and it's just going to be a little bit of vanilla and the sake that's flavoring this custard. Another key thing to consider when choosing what sake you'll be drinking or using in a dish, like I am, is whether you'd like to serve it warm, okan style, or chilled, reishu style. Most sake sommeliers will recommend that you save your best sake for a chilled drinking. Now, the sake that I used with the scallops was a junmai sake, and it was delicious, but it was not daijinjo, which requires a certain level of rice polishing, and that's the top 6% of sakes. So if I was going to be drinking the junmai sake that I used, I would probably drink it warm, because it can temper some of the off flavors of the sake and really increase the umami and the sweetness. To contrast, the nigori sake that I'm using for the creme brulee is already so creamy and mild and sweet that I think it would be best served chilled or even in a cocktail. Coming back to sake history as I brulee my custards, I wanted to talk about the Showa period and how World War II critically damaged sake production in Japan, and how the ramifications of certain choices the government made still affect the sake world today. In 1942, the food control system took an authoritarian approach to sake production, forcing sake producers to stop growing their own rice to make sake out of. The Meiji period, only about 30 years earlier, saw a flourish of sake production and innovation. But even during the post-war period, sake was never able to recover. At the beginning of the century, there were 4,600 sake producers across Japan, and today there are about 1,000. Still, we have some wonderful creme brulee and some wonderful sake producers in Japan and also across the world. I hope you enjoyed this video.